Today's chat is brought to you by, well, all of your support. Through the patronage you provide the Focus Fire chat team through Podbean's crowdfunding, we are able to provide you with the weekly podcast as well as the website and other aspects of Focus Fire chat. If you have any interest in becoming a patron of the FFC, please be sure to visit our website and click on the support link. Even a single dollar helps, and for those of you who are already patrons, thank you again for your generosity. You may have heard the whispers of guardians gathering in the shadows, exploring the mysteries of this world and the worlds which surround us. We are all in search of truth. Sometimes we need to focus that search, focus that fire. And so we come together. Join us. Join the discussion. Welcome to Focused Fire Chat. Welcome back to episode 155 of Focus Fire Chat, recorded live on January 18th over on twitch.tv/FocusFireChat. As always, I want to give a big shout out to our live chat here with us tonight. Thank you so much for joining us once again. Our topic for tonight's episode is going to be a look at biases. But first, let's run through a quick introduction of those on the show for tonight. As always, this is your host, Blue Crew 86. Next up, we have our own master of social media, the one and only Green-Eyed Music Lover. Green, I hope you're doing all right. How has the week treated you so far?
It's been rather relaxing and productive. I actually took the plunge today and decided I was going to go play Call. And believe it or not, I went 10-0 on the first part of the Luna's quest, the Luna's Howl quest, because of the new matchmaking style. I know if I would have tried this like a month and a half ago, it would have been a totally different story. But I don't feel like the matchmaking is terrible now. Like, I actually feel like I'm learning as I'm going up in rank, rather than just getting stomped as soon as I get into matchmaking. But yeah, that's what I got going.
Yeah, so I've seen that kind of bumping around on Twitter. It's a pretty contentious topic right now. But I think changes in general are always contentious, right? Which is what we'll kind of be talking about tonight, actually.
Right. And the biggest complaint that used to be what was being had is that a lot of people who were at level, like the very beginning levels, at Guardian level, were getting matched up with people who were doing Legend or Legendary and like doing Mythic and stuff like that. So they were so much further ahead that they kept getting just steamrolled every single game. So I'm impressed with the changes. I enjoy the changes. I actually can contribute to my team. So that is always helpful to me.
Yeah, it is. It is. Well, rounding out the usual team, we have our good buddy, the lore content cop himself, Beard Grizzly. Beard, how are you doing?
All right. It's. I think I will leave it at. It has been a week, and yeah, Purple, take it away.
So finally, once again in the hot seat as guest co-host, we have our good friend from the Ishtar Academy over at the Ishtar Collective, PurpleChimera. Purple, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you. I'm really struggling this week because reloading is a thing. I was using Crimson for a really long time, and then I got this Duke, and I was like, why am I always running out of bullets? And then reloading is a thing.
You need to find a trust. Find a trust. It's a little faster. Gosh, do you have at least like a faster reload? Because Duke tends to be such a slow...
It is. I mean, it has Outlaw and Rampage.
Okay. That's not too bad.
But like, I still have to press the reload button, which I didn't have to do before.
I still have to remember to push the thing.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I hear you on that.
That's my struggle this week.
There's nothing worse than getting into an encounter and like being like, oh, I got you, got the drop on them, and then realizing you have no ammo and you're just pulling an empty trigger at them.
See, I always was the person that I couldn't. That's the reason I always had trouble with Borderlands guns, because the Borderlands guns were always the ones that you couldn't like reload. You had to throw them. And I'm a compulsive.
Not all of them.
The ones that are really fun to play with, I'll put it that way.
Yeah. Okay.
But I'm a compulsive reloader. So like I'll shoot like twice. I'm like, gotta reload. Like nope. It's not, my OCD is not okay if it's like not that full clip, and I'm just like running around. I can't.
So drop mag is not a good thing for you.
No, it is not a good thing. I see that perk or I see that thing. I'm like, nap. Get it out. I'm never gonna see a benefit from that particular investment.
Oh gosh, it's so much faster.
I don't know where I was gonna go with that. Anyway, so for this episode, I don't know. My brain just turned off. For this episode, Green was kind enough to ask the community about. She was brave enough to ask this community about their biases, and I believe there was a pretty vocal response.
You know, it was vocal, and lo and behold, the very first response was my bias is that Titans are the greatest. Because that was 12 seconds after I posted it. I was like, of course a Titan's going to put that as soon as I post it. But we had some good responses besides the whole typical class bias that people tend to have. And granted, we're not talking about class bias in this episode necessarily. We're talking about bias of perspective and whatnot. But a lot of people were, how's the best way to put this? Some people have a bias in the way that they're approaching the game now because of how often they feel that the community or the developer has quote unquote let them down. So they're approaching the game with a bias in that respect, that they're being either extra judgy or feel that they get triggered at the littlest things now. Gosh, what else was there? Bias. Oh, this one I've seen a few different times. The grayest of foxes, Gray Fox Forlorn, said that I'm biased towards Dredgen and the Guardians following the Drifter because of a gun or title. I've barely played Gambit for lore and gameplay reasons, but I am biased and I won't support a shady character's plans. I've even deleted the quest for malfeasance. Don't want it. Nope. And I've had this conversation with a few different people because I proudly wear the badge of Dredgen, and I'm really excited to see if they make that consequential moving forward. Like those of us who wear Dredgen and continue with Dredgen versus those of us who are not.
A Drifter's Gambit.
Mm-hmm.
Final letter from a Drifter's Gambit is I'm hoping that they do follow through with that, because that's going to be really interesting.
I'm excited. I'm excited to get my butt handed to me, frankly, because that's what I want to see happen.
I mean, it's all made up anyway, so I mean.
Real quick, Green. I'm
just gonna kill that real fast. I guess.
Okay.
But just to expand on my small thing, like we're gonna talk about bias tonight. Y'all might hate me when all is said and done.
Well, and I think that actually segues into what I was going to toss in real quick, just an overall definition of what a bias is, because I think that can get kind of, it's like, I'm going to get in so much trouble. It's like retcon. It's misused a lot. And it's used somewhat incorrectly a lot of times to defend stuff that's not necessarily. So a bias is often synonymous with like a prejudice or a opinion or an influence or something like that. And actually the definition is it's a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or a group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. However, it also means to cause or feel or show inclination or prejudice for or against someone or something. So it's not necessarily always a negative thing, just similar. And this feels like a lot like our conversation about retcons, right? There are shades of what this word can mean. Usually when people use the term, it is in regards to like that disproportionate and unfair favor that you kind of feel either for or towards something, or an inclination of like how you feel. But the other thing too to remember about biases is that a lot of biases are learned. Like these aren't, I mean, there are, so arguably there are some biases that are, no, there's not. Biases are all learned. It's just in either it's a conscious learning or an unconscious learning. Like your experiences throughout your life will definitely flavor your worldview, your what's called a paradigm. And that paradigm is the important thing with biases to remember is that biases are not necessarily facts. They are not truth. Now they can coincide with it. Like there are some biases that tend to coincide with facts, but they are in and of themselves beliefs. And so you have to be very careful when you're expressing a bias or expressing opinion, because that's exactly what it is, right? It's an opinion. It's your perspective on a situation. And, you know, to kind of harp on that a little bit more, no one knows the full context of a situation if it's not their situation, right? I can tell you that, you know, Beard, you know, to kind of pick up on something, Beard is being quiet this evening. So there might be something going on with Beard, but I don't know what is going on with Beard. You know, if I meet a friend and they look like they've been crying, I understand that. I pick up on that. But the cause of that crying, it could be, you know, people cry for a lot of different reasons, and I don't know that context. So you have to be careful of the assumptions that you take going into a situation, which is what colors what's, again, called a paradigm. And a paradigm is basically, and the image of the banner, I see people were chatting about that in chat, or in the text chat of the live stream. The image of the banner was actually kind of a nod to that. It's the concept of what's usually called a rose-tinted glasses, right? And that's a throwback to Wizard of Oz, which I'm not going to go down that particular rabbit hole because it's a really interesting story. But anyways, the thing to remember about opinions or cognitive biases or your paradigm, whatever you want to call it, prejudice, however you want to call it, is that it colors the way you see things. But it doesn't necessarily change what you're seeing. Or it doesn't, let me rephrase. It colors and can augment how you perceive something, but the thing that you are perceiving is not going to be necessarily affected by how you see it. How you react to how you see it can't affect that. But the event that you are perceiving is still happening, and there is context outside of your awareness that you have to be aware, like that you have to understand that you do not know everything, right? In order to look at something, you have to stand at a point to look at. And in standing at that point, you are going to miss some of the context. The easiest way to explain this is if I am standing at a corner and I see a car wreck, I can see one side of the car wreck, but I by my own existence, I cannot bilocate and see all angles of that particular car wreck. And that's where the kind of the beauty, that kind of segues back into really what we try to do here with Focus Fire. You know, we try to bring in, the more people you bring into a situation, yeah, it can get messy and it can get loud and confusing, but also the more perspectives you get. And the more perspectives ultimately get a better picture, right, of what's going on. So I think that's just that would be my kind of introductory rant to biases. I don't know, Purple, did I miss anything or misspeak?
Well, no, I don't think you misspoke. I think the only thing that I bring up a lot when I talk about bias is that you're not going to be able to get rid of your bias in any situation completely because of all the things that you just talked about. But I think the more important thing, rather than remove, because people try to remove, they're like, oh, let's take away all the biases and we'll just write truth, but that's not how life works.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more important, I think, to be aware of your biases and acknowledge them. I've talked about this before when I've talked about bias in the past, where like when we write a history paper, right, a well-written history paper will acknowledge the biases of the author at the very beginning. So you know going in what their biases are, and then that helps you find a more neutral position when you're reading their papers. It's when you try to hide your biases that you get into lots of trouble.
People said that more often.
Yeah,
well, okay, but I mean, to be fair, that is very common in a lot of like strong academic works. Is usually you have it in the preface that of especially the dissertations and stuff that I've read, at least, because most of those, to be fair, are psychological, so that it's kind of hard to quantify things that is not by nature quantifiable. So a lot of times there's a preface in which that is actually discussed, and I think that's spot on. To be fair, it's like if you ever got to a point where you didn't have a bias, you wouldn't be perceiving anything.
It's very rare as well to have people that'll think on both sides of the story, like it, especially even to, as I see people nowadays as well in arguments and whatnot, it comes down to looking into the other side of the story to end up getting a more fuller picture of what's going on. That doesn't mean you're going to lose your biases or lose your overall view, but to get that secondary viewpoint can really also help with constructing your own vision and even altering how your vision is. And so often I feel like people are they're unwilling to change that opinion, I guess. They're unwilling to alter how they might have viewed something beforehand, even if it does amplify or exemplify what they were thinking beforehand, or even just like more often than not clarify what it is that they're after. Like, these are words that I've brought up, I think, several times over the last several months. And they are towards, in some cases, specific people, and in other cases, they are towards a majority. When I start talking about clarification versus a retcon, when I start talking about looking into bias versus a headcanon or something otherwise, like, all of these things have important merit and why we continue to drive them home, because there are so many viewpoints that need to be acknowledged as headcanon before they are acknowledged as being in any way, shape, or form total or utter fact. They are theory. The idea of perceived theory, the idea of perceived fact and whatnot, is something that continues to grow within a society as a whole. I look back on something, for instance, that I brought up to somebody before. The theory of relativity is a theory. Mm-hmm. It's a very practiced theory, but it's still called a theory for a reason, even if it happens to be about 500 years old. I look back over it like the theory of gravity. The same holds true there. Particle physics and molecular structure, how space and exiting, etc., can end up working and moving. All of that is theoretical. And even if we start talking about some points in history, I bring up Sun Tzu as often as I do. There are still points within there that we don't necessarily know about. I bring up the idea, too, of how a strategist didn't exist previously, and then all of a sudden Sun Tzu pops up, and there's a strategist. These are things that are very important when we kind of discuss this idea, basically, when we talk about bias. Anyway, I'm carrying this on a little bit too long.
No,
don't mind me.
No, you're not really, because if you think about trying to remove bias, the scientific perspective is probably one of the easier ways that I can assimilate it, in the fact that you don't remove bias. You acknowledge that it is there, and you can make an informed decision based off of all the information around you, not just assuming that one is correct over the other.
Yeah, that's kind of the foundation of the scientific method, is to
it's not
to neutralize, it's to in as so far as much as possible, it is to identify and take into account for it, right? Because that's why one of the golden rules of scientific exploration is repeatability. Like if you can't repeat, if you can't repeat it, then it's not it was a fluke, right? You know. The other thing,
I'm going to say that comes down to like Sigma standards and whatnot as well. Which I'm still sitting and dealing with as well. And like the whole idea of having a thing similar to scientific method is to also make sure that people go into something with some type of general accepted doctrine towards approaching a theory. Anyway, just to add on to that a little bit.
The other thing, real quick, Beard, is the other thing that came to mind. I know everyone knows I love my quotes. It's an old Aristotle quote, but it's a pretty good one, I think, in regards to what you were talking about just a few minutes ago. It goes, "It is the mark of the educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it." And I think that kind of sums up really nicely what you were talking about, right? Is the idea of I can entertain what you're saying, but that doesn't. But entertaining what you're saying and entertaining an opposing view doesn't mean that I agree with it. I do this a lot. I mean, I think, and I think everyone does this quite a bit, more than you realize, right? If you're ever in an argument and if you find yourself being like, okay, I can kind of see where you're coming from. I don't agree with you, but I see, like, I can at least understand where you're coming from. To form a logical argument, you have to have a degree of that, because that's how you counter argue. Like, I mean, you can't have a counter argument without being able to, at least to some degree. I mean, I guess you could if you just want to insult people, but that's not very effective. You know, like, in order to actually win an argument, not by badgering, but by actual, like, winning the argument or winning the debate, you have to understand where the opposing side is coming from. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind too, especially kind of going into biases, because kind of to pull this back into the concept of bias, you know, we've kind of mentioned cognitive biases, and cognitive biases, Chad actually was talking about what's one that's called the rosy retrospection. It's the good old days, air quotes, on, like, you know, Destiny 1 was so much better. No, not necessarily. Like, there might be some cases, this transitions into the conversation of, like, well, what do you mean by better? Because mechanically, there might be things that, yeah, they might have done quote unquote better. I mean, but everything is opinionated, right? It's all in the eye of the beholder, if you will. And so when you say the good old days, that's often a form of what's called rosy retrospection, which is a psychological bias or phenomenon of people basically judging the prior events as better. Nostalgia is another kind of phenomenon that ties into this very closely, and that it's just not true. Like, it's a lot of people are like, you know, these are just, you know, this is just a bad time to be alive. And it's like, no, actually, it's actually really good. If you look at all the historical, like, mechanical facts of what is going on in the world today, we actually have a pretty good life. Like, we have, I don't know, modern medicine. That's a pretty cool thing.
Air conditioning.
Oh my gosh.
Penicillin is kind of useful, guys. You know, just a heads up there. You know, whether or not you're allergic to it, that's a whole different conversation. But, like, the fact that we have modern medicine,
there's ways to work around that.
Right. The fact that the vast majority of humanity is able to live past the age of, I don't know, 6 months is a pretty big deal. Like, that's, I mean, just that's just in the last couple hundred years that has changed. So, like, it's called rosy retrospection is a particular psychological phenomenon. And that's just one. I mean, I think there's over 180 recognized cognitive biases currently. And I mean, that's just the ones that have been documented, and those are unique. Like those are separate, unique biases. And a lot of times when you're in a conversation with someone who is like feeling a bias or is expressing a bias, there's a lot of times where those are actually blends of different types of biases. Not any one person is going to have this, like, there is no one that has the same point of view as another person. That's both the beauty and the annoying thing about humanity, is everyone has their own point of view and their own will of how to react to that point of view. And we see that in, kind of going back into the concept of perception, which is what Purple was kind of mentioning earlier, is like, there's no way to neutralize that. Actually, that's something that you want. You want to have differences in perception, because by having differences in perceptions, you get different facets and you get different points of view, and those different ranges will basically, hopefully, eventually culminate in a better picture of reality that you are experiencing, that you are living in, right? And that's both a philosophical and a realistic argument, as from a scientific empirical standpoint as well. The more paradigms that you can synergize, the better overall picture of what you're getting will become. The more that you will neutralize the rose tint of the glasses through which we look at reality, is hopefully that's ultimately the end goal of not just recognizing biases, but that's the end goal of recognizing those biases, is so that we can take it into account.
So let's talk about some of the biases in Destiny.
Yeah, I think that Purple, I know you had, I know we had mentioned last episode the difference between dynamic and static storytelling. Do you want to kind of explain what that kind of means, as far as, like, this was back, I think it was in March of last year, so it's around episode 123, I believe. I don't remember how much we got into the dynamic versus static presentation of storytelling and lore, but I know we had mentioned it. Do you want to kind of explain what that means and the differences?
Sure. So basically, like, a static story is like a narrated story arc, right? Obviously, even narrated books can get quite complicated, but at some point they are contained in a box, whereas dynamic storytelling is like more sandboxy, right, where you create an entire world and people are interacting and things are much more complicated, and you have different perspectives. So that's like real life, more like real life is, because, as we mentioned previously, there's not ever one answer for anything in real life. And that's kind of the direction that we're going with Destiny lore as they expand and complicate the storyline. It gets more complicated, and there's less black and white, good and bad kind of characters.
So it's more real than fiction,
right? It's more realistic. Insofar as the connections between people and the narrations of the story.
Because I remember, I can't remember if it was with us or during one of the podcasts with Baxter and Kex, that you had made a comment about that was actually the fun part about video game, analysis, is that it's inherently, you inherently have a box of rules that everyone knows, right? And those rules can change, but if they change, everyone knows them. Whereas with like reality, it's like, what is going on? We have no idea historically what this person's life was,
Right. Like in real life, I can find a box in the attic of letters and I can spend my whole life tracking down who these people are and never learn anything about them. right?
It sounds like you're talking from experience there.
Yeah. And if they're dead, then you can't ask them any questions, right?
That's
it's
as
really
morbid of a comment
frustrating.
as that is also fascinatingly accurate, because it goes back into, like, I mean, honestly, you could say that about someone who's alive too, right?
Right. Sometimes people don't want to answer your question.
Right. In Destiny, we have characters who are alive and well, and they are just as, if not more, mysterious than some of the ones that we don't have alive and well.
Zer,
right.
cough.
Well, I mean, so Zer, Mara,
Yeah.
there's a number of, Shin, it's going to be a big one here in a couple weeks. There's a number of ones that are out there that are just as mysterious, if not more so, than some of the quote unquote gone ones.
Yeah. Well, and the point that I was making with the video game comment was that I know, because this is a curated set of information that I have been given by a group of storytellers, right? Mm-hmm. So there might be something that's a red herring, right? But everything they've put in for a reason.
On purpose.
Right? So, like, if there's something that causes us to go down a rabbit hole, like take the Resoluzier thing, right? We didn't have all the information at the beginning, right?
We still don't have all the information, technically.
Well, yes, sure. But, we as a community drew a series of varied conclusions based on the information that we had. Then Bungie said, okay, here is the next set of information. Now you have new information that you can add to. I'm like, oh, now we have more information. Let's change, what we know. That doesn't always happen in real life. And sometimes something that you, as the researcher, think is important, the person who created the document didn't think was important. And so they make one comment about it and then they never say anything ever again. And then you don't know if it was ever important or not.
Stupid hunter outfit. Hunter.
Well,
what was it? Class items?
It was class items, yeah.
Yeah.
To just clarify real quick, though, I want to go back real quick, because I would argue that, so the way, this feels like splitting hairs, but the way that the information, yeah, it probably is. The way that the information was revealed about the Resoluzier/Yor event, that does mirror reality. However, I think what you were saying is that Bungie knew the end before we even got the beginning, and that's what doesn't mirror reality, right? It's a narrated, yes. It's a controlled drip of
specifically
information. Engineered.
Right.
I think would be the word, right, Green, that you're going for? It's like specifically engineered process and a controlled.
Yeah.
Whereas it might be it was, because like I remember when we were talking to John about that, the example that I keep going back to is the exploration of the Great Pyramid, or the pyramids, right? You would have everything that you've excavated, and you're like, all right, this is 100% how these people lived, and then someone trips and falls through a wall, and everything just gets thrown out because now you have new context, and you have to have that fluidity. But the difference between reality and Destiny here is that there's an illusion of that dynamic. Let me back up and try to
dynamic.
Talk. Yes, that word, which I don't know why that word gave me a twist. There's the illusion of the story being dynamic, but in reality, it really is actually pretty static.
It's static from the perspective. It's static in the perception of the actual writers.
Correct.
For us, it appears dynamic.
Right, and even to a degree, that's where the mature conversation of retcons, not the let's throw it against the wall and hope it sticks conversation, but like the actual use of the narrative tool of retconning, that is where that comes in, because there are events that even within a static story need to be treated dynamically. Does that phrase make sense to anyone else, or was that just in my head?
I mean, it made sense to me.
Okay. I was like, I said it, and I'm like, that was possibly really good. So like, even in a book, even in a work of fiction, there are events that you have to go back and clarify and possibly tweak. And that is where the tool of retcon actually comes into play. And that's not always a negative thing, because that's often what helps build the illusion of a dynamic world, right? Is, oh, hey, this is a bit of information that you didn't have yet, and here's what's going to be used to clarify. I mean, the Rezyl Azir arc is a amazingly great example of that entire illusion / reality of what was going on between us as consumers and Bungie as the creators of what is being consumed.
Yeah, and I think like the thing that I love the most about it is like having the ability to go through all the lore that we have and all of the flavor text that we have, and knowing that someone put it there for a reason. So any one of these things could be important and could show up later.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Some of the things that what Beard was finding at the beginning of D2 that we were like, oh, this doesn't make any sense. Why is this here? And he finds like that one line back from that one card, from that one item.
Yeah. So it's the difference between like going through a curated box of a curated puzzle versus like,
I like that,
going through someone's house and like some of that stuff is important and some of that stuff is not important and you don't know.
Right. Well, I mean, I like that example actually, because it's like we've been given a box of a 5,000 piece puzzle. You can give a different person the same size box of handwritten letters, and it's going to be completely, different, because the puzzle has an end. The puzzle has a purpose. It has a telos, or whatever you want to refer to it as. There is a point at which the puzzle is complete and you see the full picture for what it is. Whereas with the box of handwritten letters, it's like, well, I don't know. These could be, we don't know. Like, we have no idea where it ends, where it begins. Like, what is the purpose of some of these? I think that's this different. That's really I think that's a great way of looking at the difference between a dynamic and a true static story. The static would be the puzzle, and the dynamic would be the box of letters.
Yeah.
So do we want to dive into the one that I know Purple's kind of chomping at the bit to get to with the Drifter lore?
You mean a Drifter's Gambit?
Oh, man. So, okay. Drifter.
Or is that actually the one or is that the one, or is that
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
That's the one that I've noticed her talking about. Don't let me step on your toes or anything, Purple, but that's the one you've mentioned to me multiple times.
I mean, yeah. So, what started off on this whole thing was I was trying to write a summary, like it's my job to do. To write these nice summaries. And I was like, oh, I'm having a good time writing summaries about books, right? Instead of having to click through 4,000 item descriptions for the other categories. I was like, I'll just keep writing summaries about books. And then I got to Drifter's Gambit. And I was like, we're in a fight now. Because here's the thing. All of these entries are very clearly that the renegade is writing, they're very clearly biased against the drifter, right? The renegade, he does not like the drifter. He, she, they, I don't know.
Until
It's
the
a
end.
mystery.
Until the
Well,
very end. There's some
he
sort of...
still doesn't really like him.
No,
I
he
mean,
doesn't. He doesn't, but utilizes.
Yeah, he sees a use for him. Or
There you
they
go.
see a use for him, I guess, to be fair to Purple's comment there.
Mm.
Yeah. So, but we know so little about the drifter from any other perspective. I mean, this is really the biggest chunk of information we have about him. And I just don't feel comfortable writing any kind of summary aside from like, here is a series of entries about how a renegade feels about the drifter.
Yeah.
You know, and so like it's here we go, like we need another perspective in order to make some kind of generalizing statement about the drifter.
So
I don't know if that will make sense if anyone hasn't read it, but
I mean, I always just thought we could just call him a cannibal and move on, but that might be me.
Beard just gave the tactful answer that I was going to give because I have a summarizing statement about him, but I'm not going to say it on this show.
I mean, to be fair as well, even when we get something from Drifter, it still seems like it's mired in a lot of like really reclusive fog. Even when we get stories that are told of him doing things out on patches of land, it still feels like it's mired in this like unnatural idea of him just being a storyteller, which, you know, that's really, it really grabs at like what being a hunter is almost all about, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
They rely on tales and they rely on hearsay, so why not push that to the nth degree? That's all that it really feels like to me whenever I read almost anything about the Drifter per this point, which gets into a completely different topic of discussion that I will not go down just yet, but just saying, I don't know, I don't see a lot of I don't see a lot of stuff that's going on with him that I've been able to believe to this point yet. Even when it's like sitting in front of my face, I'm just like, this guy is the constant thing that we get even from like kind old Eva is he's not to be trusted. That's the biggest thing overall that I continue to sit back and go, sure, okay. Anyway.
I mean, I'm not saying he should be trusted.
Oh, I'm not saying that you think that either. I'm just saying that we're constant from like anybody that's like outside looking in, especially like somebody like Eva, who I would say is a very good judge of character, where we consistently get this notion of don't trust him. I'm like, all right, I'm just not going to trust him or anything he has to tell me. I mean, I don't see the harm in this right now.
Well, okay, so the Drifter's Gambit book specifically is written with that bias. Can we trust everything that the renegade says himself? We're talking about not trusting Drifter, but because it's all biased in the text itself, because it's only from one perspective, only from a very opinionated gentleman or female or thing, can we even say 100% that we can trust what they've written because of the bias?
I mean, that's the thing, right? So we don't know who this character is. We don't, like,
We can assume, but that's
right,
not giving us
some
any
guesses.
Oh,
right?
I've got some assumptions, let me tell you.
We have some guesses. Some might even be educated guesses, right? But we don't know. And so, like, here we get into things like, all right, all of these are tagged with like a renegade's observations of a drifter, right? So is the renegade observing these in their diary? In a recorded log that they're sending back to the Vanguard? You know, like, you talk about things differently depending on your audience, right? I write about an event in my personal journal using different words and different vocabulary, different phrasing than I would if I was going to tell my best friend about it.
That's an interesting perspective.
Different than I'm going to tell my boss about what happened. You know, the same event that happened to me.
Right.
You know, so this is another thing, like, regardless, if setting aside the moment about whether the renegade can be trusted to tell the truth, like, maybe the renegade did see all these things happen, right? But you're going to write about it differently if you're just writing for your own sake than if you're making a report to somebody.
You can't even assume what kind of what he's writing in on this one either. Like,
right. We don't know. Like, it's in quotes. It sure sounds like the renegade is talking to somebody, but it could be a log. You know, maybe they don't have paper journals in the future. Maybe they have, you know, starship captain logs.
That would be interesting.
So maybe it's a auditory version of a journal.
Well, and I think
maybe
too,
it's not.
Another example that I immediately thought of, Purple, when you were talking about that is, I don't know if everyone has had a chance to see Solo yet, but there's a scene where Lando, or Donald Glover, who plays Lando, is in the Millennium Falcon, and he's writing, or he's recording a drama, but it's like a dramatic retelling of, quote, adventures that he had. That's also kind of like, you know, with the Ancient Apocalypse armor, where we have the recordings from the Drifter for Posterity, part 1 of 5, or something like that. Mm-hmm. Like, he is recording that with the intent, like the intent is there to be shared. You're not right. Writing. And I think I'm sorry if I'm repeating that, but I think that's what you were saying, right? It's that the intent of the created content is just as important, if not more so, than what is being created, because it tells us how it determines the flavor in which something is made. Would that be an accurate summary of what you were saying?
Yes. And then the other thing, to put another layer on it, because we don't have enough layers, you know,
you're an onion.
Is right. Why is the renegade observing the Drifter in the first place? So, like, there's a difference between the renegade is at the tower. The Vanguard says, hey, there's this creepy guy doing weird things out in the universe. You should go find him and see what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then off he goes, right? And he's like, man, I got to watch this creepy guy do weird things. Versus, like, here comes the renegade going about his business doing something else and happens to come across someone who's doing something that is interesting in that it brings it to his attention, right? Okay, now, like, this is a weird thing that I came across. Something happened to cause the renegade to pay attention. Maybe then later he gets, you know, loops in the Vanguard or, you know, whatever else he's doing. But do you understand the difference that I'm saying?
The intent of...
Right, because if the renegade is sent out from the beginning saying this person is doing weird things, like maybe bad things, we don't know, and you need to observe them, then probably that person is going to view anything that person does as suspicious. right?
He's being sent in the world with already an angle.
Exactly. As opposed to like, here's the renegade going off doing his own thing, and then he's like, wow, that's a person doing weird stuff. That colors it a different way.
Going out with an agenda versus not, or like just their own bias against the person.
Right.
Makes sense. It makes me wonder. So, makes me wonder if the writer himself is technically biased against, as a lifelong bias type thing, hinting at the possible identity of him being Shen Malfur, which is kind of a theory that a lot of people tend to have at this point. Not necessarily a true theory, but a theory.
Yeah. I mean, it's reasonable as any others. I won't say any others, but that's probably not true.
I mean, he's not.
I could come up with something that would make you doubt that.
He's not Zavala. So, I mean, or at least, God, I hope he's not Zavala. I'm already mad at that.
That would be really complicated.
That would be weird.
I have questions. Well, but I think also the other thing too that this is pointing at, and to hammer this home again, is that this points to the storytelling aspect that is that is Destiny. Because normally with a lot of stories, we're used to being told things from a narrator's point of view. We don't have that at all in Destiny. All of the information that we've gotten is from in-game. It's from the perspective of people in the world. And so the thing too to remember is like what Purple is saying about the renegade here is, what is that person's agenda? And I don't say this, I don't mean this nefariously. What is that person's agenda? Everyone has an agenda. Everyone has a angle from which they are not only seeing things, but also retelling those things. Witness bias is a huge contention point within, even reality as far as legal systems go. That is a legit concern. And that's the same thing that's happening here, is you have to understand the individual who's telling it almost, if not more so than the individual that they're telling you about. Another example from Destiny 1 is the Books of Sorrow. I mean, that was a massive information dump for sure, but it was also a giant piece of propaganda from the Hive, for the Hive. And so reading that, you had to take into account that, yeah, this is a lot of information, but did everything actually happen the way that we're being told here? There's some things that didn't necessarily line up with other things that we were seeing. And so and that's not, I know a lot of people will jump on that as quote unquote bad writing, but actually I think that's actually a sign of
real life.
Well, I mean, there's that, but actually that's what I was going to go with. I think if you have that type of discrepancy, that actually might be a sign of really, really good writing, because that means that they are actively writing from the perspective of the one individual, not from the whole picture, not from a narrator's point of view. They're actively able to flip the bias from which they're viewing what is going on in the world. You have to understand so much in order to be able to do that particular feat. Like that's why a lot of fiction stories are not written from a first person perspective, because it's really freaking hard to write that way.
Yeah. If you've ever tried to plot out any kind of complicated narrative and then try to tell the story from only one character's perspective, and then you have to hold the whole story in your head, but remember what only this one character knows.
Yeah. You have to you have to make yourself ignorant of your own world. And it just, to me, like I've dabbled in like short stories and stuff, and like I've tried it, and even like I've managed to maybe do a little bit of it, but it takes a ton of like mental energy to keep that balance, because you, at the same time, you also don't want to share too much. Right?
I think the thing that helps combat that, like a skill or a way to practice it, is going into D&D and going into a session and where you have a a DM talking to a specific character at the table who is the only one technically in the room, you can do it two ways. You can literally force everybody at the table to leave except for the one character who's getting talked to, or you can practice
out of character knowledge
and trying to contain what your character knows within a certain realm and not use the information until the person tells you.
Yeah, that's so hard.
It's hard. It is really hard to do, but it's a good way to practice if you're an aspiring writer who wants to write in that kind of genre. Playing D&D or role playing and only knowing the things that your character knows rather than knowing all the secrets of the realm. It's hard, but it's good to do.
So a tangent on that I just you're talking about that just made me realize this. But I honestly think that with role playing games, I'm really a big fan of this. But we role play whenever we do role playing games. We actually do it through like Roll20, which is an online app. And one of the sad things, actually, in hindsight, now that you're saying what you're saying, Green, is that OOC information is no longer a concern when you use an app like that, because you can just DM the individual character, right? So there is no need for people to compartmentalize information like that. And actually, I think that's kind of a sad thing, because people are missing out. That's a really actually important skill that role playing actually did teach, as far as like a useful real life skill. And I think that's interesting, because people who might not have ever played an actual tabletop role-playing game, like the original, like paper and pencil, like legit paper and pencil, would have no idea that existed. And that, I don't know, just from a psychological standpoint, I think that might color a little bit on where some of the confusion maybe on the bias for games like Destiny kind of maybe stem from it. I'd just be interested. Now my researcher brain is turned on, and I'm like interested in like different demographics of the degrees of not comprehension's the wrong word, but the degrees of speaking out against quote unquote retcon and anger against misperceived bad writing or whatever. I'd be curious how many people who are really outspoken against, poor writing in any game, really, honestly, have actually experienced what you just described, because I agree 110% with how you just described it. That is an extremely accurate example of what is going on within Destiny specifically, is that we are playing a tabletop game in which we do not have access to the OOC information at all. Like we have no scope of what's going on, and we're just rolling gather information checks, and we don't know who's lying and who's not.
Yeah, but there are characters in the game who do know, and they're not sharing at all. Mara.
And that's kind of the argument. That's actually the argument that's kind of going on in chat right now, is like, that brings up the question, is that necessarily a good thing, right? Sometimes, and that's a valid point. Like, some people play video games and play games to escape reality. They don't want that. Right. And that's a fair assessment.
But the thing is you want to be able to have the suspension of disbelief, right? That's the whole goal of the escapism, is being able to immerse yourself in such a way that you can believe what you're playing.
Right. It's a fine line, for sure.
It is a fine line. And talk about our own biases. Pens and I joke about this all the time in chat, that he has a bias against Mara and the Awoken kind of the royalty at the moment. And I have a bias against Zavala and the Vanguard. Just, I acknowledge that. I know that it is stupid, but we kind of joke with each other a little bit about how ridiculous it is and how our own biases color our perceptions of everything that's happening with them. So what happened with last week and Mara getting pissy with the ghost, so many people online were just furious about it. And I'm like, no, I would be pissed too. Because, I mean, if I was a queen and I had some pipsqueak ghost telling me what I should be doing, I'd be pissed. I can see it from her perspective. But
I mean,
others don't
again,
see it that way.
That's again a situation where you can see it from both perspectives, right? I mean,
that's a difference.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But I think that's a content. Like I can get myself in trouble really fast following that comment. But I was going to say, like, that is an excellent example of being shown the context, of seeing two sides of the same picture. Because from Ghost's perspective, Mara is being very standoffish. She is not being involved. We don't, like, you know, from our perspective or from Ghost's perspective, she is being a quote unquote bad queen. Whereas from Mara's perspective, she's looking at it from a different angle, maybe a bigger picture. To be fair, we don't know, but she has just as much right to respond the way she did to Ghost, because Ghost, I mean, you know, it's that age old thing of, like, I mean, yeah, she might be coming down hard on him, but remember, Ghost was the one that slighted her first. Mm-hmm. When it comes down to it, you know, that's kind of where her anger is striking a chord, I think. And I think that might be because the vast majority of our perspective is from Ghost's perspective. So we actually kind of naturally will align more from his frustrations because it makes sense from us. But I mean, we don't know what is going on. There is a bigger picture moving, and, you know, whether or not it's true that she is being standoffish, you know, we don't know. We don't know the context of that. So her frustration,
and also she could be being standoffish and also be justified in that.
Right. That's what I was about to say. It's like, you know, that makes me, and again, kind of pulling in, you know, another tangent is it makes me think of the Infinity War, right, with Doctor Strange, where he's like, I've seen 14 million and only one works, and then he's like, I'm sorry, and then everything kind of goes to hell in a handbasket. But it's like, the question is so are you still on the path to the one, or are you still, like, you know, there's things that are done that in the short term might look bad, but in a long game or a long-term gain actually end up being beneficial. And so the problem is that
lose the battle, win the war.
Yeah, you don't want a Pyrrhic victory, right? You don't want to lose. You don't want to win the battle to lose the war. You'd rather lose the battle and win the war.
Right.
So, I mean, and that's where, you know, and I feel Beard might jump in on me on this one, but that's where the question of strategy-wise, you see the difference between Ghost and Mara. Ghost is more focused on the short-term gain, and Mara's more focused on, you know, the overall war. Is the kind of the dynamic that seems to be presented right there.
I don't know if Ghost is necessarily focused on the short-term gain, because he's focused on the awoken people, because right now the latest things that we've been seeing with the Corsairs is that a lot of them are very frustrated and angry and beaten down because of the continual cycle that happens. Mm-hmm. Well, so we see that perspective of it. I don't know if it's necessarily a short-term goal of Ghost to...
Well, he's also in the trenches. Like,
right.
I think that's what he says, if I remember correctly. It's like, you're not here where your people are suffering. Like, I guess that would be a more accurate. Ghost is looking at it from inside the battle, whereas Mara might be more of the
general outside strategist.
Yeah, like the person who's playing chess as opposed to the person or the piece that's being played with, I guess, if that makes a weird amount of sense.
This week's comments from him actually mirror that sentiment entirely.
Oh, do they? Okay.
Of course, we don't know if he had a response for Mara from when she absolutely lip-lashed him.
I mean, regardless of how you feel, I mean, like, I think that both sides had really good points, and I think they both kind of had. I think they both got digs in that were valid. I really do. I enjoyed listening to Ghost's little tantrum, and I enjoyed having Mara come down and being like, "Stop it."
Yeah, no, I actually really liked that part. It showed a piece of her character that I was hoping to see at one point or another. But
yeah, it showed the regalness. Like she has a spine, and it's not just I know I'll probably get grief for this, but it's not just a pretty face. Like she actually will back up the threats.
Mm-hmm. But the biggest thing that he had kind of mentioned was that he worries about those that are out and are fighting each and every week, and if they will ever actually see the outcome of what it is that they're actually doing throughout this curse and this constant cycle that just keeps going on. So just to back up what you were talking about.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. Was that when he dropped the one is it Amrita who bleeds out?
Yes, Amrita. She's the first one. Yeah, she's week 1.
But I mean, wasn't this argument when he kind of mentions that he has to watch this every single time?
Technically, does the Techian mention that is Amrita? We always assume that it's Amrita at the end because she's the one who's injured. But I don't remember if the Techian is the one, like if that is the floating Corsair, the same one.
I swear there was a line about her bleeding out. I know Purple, you had also mentioned Zavala and Eva.
Oh, sure.
About how perspectives change.
Yes. So in the book Dawning Delights, the very first entry, which is called Lighter Days, is, well, one, it's a really great card if you haven't read it, or entry, or whatever you want to call them. And it basically is a summary of Eva Levante's perspective on Zavala. Right? Zavala is one of the first people she meets when she goes to the tower forever and ever ago. And she thinks that he's really like stern and angry, and like basically he has no sense of humor, right? And she gets nervous every time he walks by. And then like here he comes and he makes a joke. And like she's kind of shocked, like not expecting Zavala to be the kind of person to tell a joke. And then she's like, oh, now I've changed my perspective, and like he's a nice guy. Like, yeah, he's the leader of the Vanguard, and he has to be serious a lot of the time, but like he also has a personality and a sense of humor, and they're kind of friends at the end. So it was just a really nice, succinct, 1-page summary of how your bias can change versus from one interaction with something.
Interestingly enough, I would say that all of the Dawning Delights worked to change our perspectives on all the characters that are in them.
Yes, I would agree with that for sure.
It makes me respect
that one was just the most,
right arm
I think,
a bit more.
Hawthorne punching what's his face in the nose. Yeah, everybody as soon as that card dropped, everybody messaged me. I'm like, guys, I'm okay. I realize he's a jerk. It's fine.
I just love it. I was like, oh man, oh, that made me happy.
But yeah, I just thought the Zavala one was the most blatant, obvious, I guess.
Well, she just outright states it, which is nice. What about the man who they called Cade? That book. Did you have trouble writing a summary for that one?
Well, there isn't a summary, so. But it's a different kind of issue, right? So I put that one next to a Drifter's Gambit, because the Drifter's Gambit is like outsider's bias, right? We're watching the renegade have all these observations about the Drifter, and we don't know what the Renegade's perspective is on the Drifter, so we can't really draw a lot of conclusions about him.
Right.
But Cade is writing about himself.
Because Cade is great.
Right. But because of the nature of being an exo, he is also unsure about a lot of things about himself. So every life that he has, every number that he gets is biased. The next one is biased based on the notes the last one left, which is a whole different situation.
Oh man, talk about the layers. The layers of interpretation, interpreting your own. Oh gosh, that would have been kind of a pain in the butt to write.
You mean interpreting the things that Clovis Bray left him to read? Yeah.
Mm.
And then, like, once you get into things like, okay, so how many times did he do this? Right? Obviously, he did it at least twice, right? Because he mentions having looked at the notes back before. But every time, every cycle that he leaves himself notes, he's interpreting more, because that's another layer of interpretation. You know, and like in history, and I talked about primary sources and secondary sources in the Ishtar Collective episode I did about research bias. And so now it's like the first set of notes is a primary source on that life. And then the second set of notes is, okay, now he's gone through and he's read all of these notes, and now he's commenting on his interpretation of them. And then you get another layer of that, and then another layer of, I mean, how many layers did he get? 6 at the most, I guess.
Right. If they're counting that, if they're starting at 1 instead of
1, unless they, but we don't know that he did it every single time either.
Right.
You know, we don't know. So, like, how convoluted does it get? How many interpretations? And did he erase the previous ones when he made the new ones?
Don't know.
Yeah, see, it gets
convoluted.
It gets complicated.
Oh yeah, for sure. Are there any other books that strike you that are just obvious? Like, what about Maracena? Is that, would you consider that having a lot of bias because of the perspective that it's written from?
Yeah. I think that the Maracena is a lot like the Books of Sorrow, right? They are told to the reader. And so there is a kind of performance there. And then you have to get into, like, okay, why are you telling me this? Right? This isn't someone's journal that we found. This is something that is being presented to you.
True. But what about the histories of things? Like, okay, when you're writing a historical paper or a review on an event, when you're relaying that, how do you prevent such bias within the paper itself? Because it's going to be written from a perspective. That's how history a lot of times is relayed.
Right. So when I'm writing a research paper, the first thing you do is there's a huge, like, preface or prologue where you talk about your perspective and why you're writing the paper, right? Why I'm writing this book. And so that will give your audience a an understanding of your biases. That's the purpose of it. So whenever I come across a document that is made for public consumption that doesn't have that kind of prologue, then I immediately start thinking, okay, now I'm trying to guess what the person's motivations are for writing this. And how does that change the perspective and interpretations of their words?
Okay. Instead of just relaying what they said from their perspective as wholesale.
Right. Because if I'm telling a history, right, I can tell you I can tell you what happened during the Civil War, right? I can list all the battles that happened, and I can tell you how many soldiers died and, where the troops moved around, right? I can also tell you the story of this Union soldier, and I can tell you the story of this Confederate soldier, and I can tell you the story of this runaway slave, right? And I can tell you the story of this town. But the way that I study their information changes the way that I tell that story. Because if I'm a military historian, the only significant parts that I'm going to tell you are the people that were important to the military strategy of that battle.
Right.
But if I'm a social historian, I'm going to talk about this impact of that battle on the town, right? What happened to the people who lived in the town? What happened to the mill workers? So that's a different story, and it's going to emphasize certain parts and de-emphasize other parts. But I don't know what got left out in the story of the Awoken because Mara didn't decided it wasn't important from her perspective, but maybe somebody else would have thought it was important.
Right. So, gosh, it's just going from the Mara Senna specifically because it seems like such a dictated history.
Yeah, well, it is. But so are the books of sorrow.
But they're dictated with the stuff that we also talked about last time with
these books are lies.
Right. Well, and so that's the thing with the books of sorrow, right? They are also a dictated history of their people. But we know enough about them to make guesses about the motivations of the author on why they were written. Right? So is it going to be different? I don't know Mara well enough to make this guess, but my first question would be, is the Mara Senna for the Awoken people or for other people?
Right? Who's because the intended audience?
You write your history differently. I talk about history differently if I'm talking to a person from a local person or a foreigner, right? When I give a tour at the antebellum house, the first thing I do when I walk in the door is I introduce myself and I ask them where you're from, because we get people from all over the world. Right. I'm going to tell that story differently to someone whose family has lived in the same town for 3 generations than I am to someone who's from China. Right?
Right.
It's the same story, technically, right? But I tell it differently because other people, outsiders, need more context.
They don't need the nitty-gritty, too. They need
right. And then you get into things like if this is written, if the Mara Senna has been written to be propaganda for non-awoken people, right? Then it's like an ambassador. So then you have a layer of, okay, what does Mara want other people to think about the Awoken, right? You want to does she want them to think that the Awoken are good people? She might kind of change her language to make it seem better. I don't know. I mean, I don't know because we don't have all the answers. But do you understand what I'm saying? Like, you present yourself differently as an ambassador for your country, and that's what it is, if that's who her audience is, versus if you find something that's supposed to be internal, right? It's like an internal memo for a company versus like a public memo. They use different language, even if they say ultimately the same thing.
It'd be such a difficult thing to write, to keep that in mind as well as a personal writer.
Oh gosh, the storytellers are just brilliant.
Interesting. And I wonder, as far as like storytellers go, if they, when they're writing their stories, I know that some writers take leads on certain types of stories. We talk about John Goff and the Last Word Thorn story and the Your story quite a bit. But I wonder how many of them stay blind to certain aspects of the story to help write more authentically, or if they keep that in mind and are able to separate, like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's the thing, right? Because most of the time when we talk about like writing a novel, like you might have one or two people helping you, but for the most part, novels are written by one person.
Right.
Right. Like Jim Butcher, I'm sure, has somewhere like a map in his house with colored string, right? Like of
with
all the
crazy
different
guy.
things that are happening.
Oh God. I can't even imagine with that world.
God. So, but Bungie has a whole team, right? It's not just one person. And so, like, I don't know how they've divided up those things. Like, if it were me, I'd be like, okay, you're on the Awoken team and you're on the Hive team, and you know, so that like, here, create the Vex, histories and stuff. But they also interact with each other. So then, like, what do you have? Someone from the Hive team go and knock on the Awoken's door? Like the Awoken teams come knock on the Hive door, like, hey, we're gonna try to blow up your ship. Like, I don't know how that works.
Yeah, totally. Oh goodness. It's just mind-boggling to try to think and go through all the aspects that as a writer you would have to go through, or as an interpreter of the writing you have to keep in mind, because keeping in mind the audience and stuff like that is not something I always think about. Like, who is this being written for? Like, obviously the Drifter's Gambit one, you can keep in mind for the most part that the intent looks like it is journalistic type writing. I don't know if journalistic is a word, but it is in my book now. Yay. But the intent on other things, you don't think about the audience. Like, I've never considered that the Maracena was written not for the Awoken people, but for those of us who are unfamiliar with the Awoken. And it's not just a history book for their junior high kids, essentially, to go through if they have junior high kids. But it's something for us to interpret for them, and maybe slight propaganda like the Books of Sorrow. Which, every history propaganda, but whatever.
Sure, but it's different. And Chat brought up a really good point too, that the means of acquisition changes, because I think, kind of fall into this trap, especially like with Ishtar, then everything is in these nice, neat little pages. And you kind of forget that, like, with the Books of Sorrow, we had to go like find these weird things and bring them back to Eris, and she had to interpret them for us. Like, that's how we got those.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, these pages of the Maracena came out of Bone Whispers, right?
So, interpreted Bone Whispers by Eris.
Right. Right. So it's not like this is literally a book. Like we call it a book.
Right.
But like, it's not like we were just walking around the reef and we're like, hey, someone dropped this book. Right? Like,
there's no first person account necessarily. It's an
right.
interpreted.
And then it's like, okay, who interpreted them, and like why did the bones have the story in the first place? Right? Was that the original intention for them to be discovered? Like, did Mara write them and then put them in the bones because space magic, and then that's what we're supposed to do? Or like, did she write a book and then the bone, like the creature ate the book and then
absorbed
the knowledge? Like, I don't know.
Interesting. So many little perspectives. Or just the whole, I mean, yes, it's a video game and it has reasons for all the different things. Sometimes it's just like, also, is it just game mechanics as a way to deliver the lore to us?
Well, sure. Yeah, of course. At some point, we will hit a point where it's like, because video games.
Oh,
right?
Yeah. Always.
But I feel like for the most part, I have hit the because video games point very few times in Destiny. Like, in comparison to what I would have expected. Right? They really do a very good job of trying to give a lore explanation for most things. You know, obviously we can get into like balancing weapons and stuff like that. I'm not talking about that stuff. But like,
why is there a nuclear weapon with a black armory in the middle of the city by the crater that we have to destroy because reasons? Yeah. I'm still trying to figure that one out lore-wise.
Well, maybe we'll find out later.
God, I hope so, because right now that raid is real confusing to me.
Yeah.
Riven, I understand. Like, the lore reasons behind Riven make sense to me. The lore reasons behind the Scourge of the Past, no clue at the moment.
Yeah, well, and like, even if you look back, like, I think this is one of the things that gets so interesting when you get into these games like Destiny that have expansions and where the company that's making them really interacts with the community. Because I think it's my guess that Bungie has realized along the way how much more excited the community is getting about the story than they originally anticipated. Because, I mean, you can look at like the card for Warlock from Destiny 1.
Yes.
Which is like, I mean, it's like three sentences. It says, warrior scholars of light, warlocks devote themselves to understanding the traveler and its power. A warlock's mind is an arsenal of deadly secrets, balanced between godhood and madness. On the battlefield, those secrets can shatter reality itself. Like, that's pretty cool. That sounds really awesome. Like, I want to do that thing, right? And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but like, if you look at the entry for Dawnblade, it's like a little tiny narrative.
Yeah. I remember the whole, like, when we got our first new subclasses with the Stormcaller and everything back in, what was it? It wasn't even Rise of Iron. Was it Taken King when we got those subclasses?
Yep. King.
With Night Stalker and everything, the stories involved with all of them.
The Stormcaller had one of the best in-game story explanations. Like, and all of them did. Tevis had a great one. That was also where we got introduced to the was it Ouroboros?
The Sunbreakers.
And the Stormcaller was really a explanation of our guardians as powers surpassing even the vanguards in some degree. was like we didn't really get introduced to necessarily a new character with the Stormcaller, but we got introduced to a new aspect of the impact of what our actions had done to the world, as far as like Ikora's response to our training, which was really, really cool. Not to mention we actually got to see like the meditation and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. For sure. For sure. Oh, goodness. This topic is like a never-ending topic in some ways.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Blue, what do you think? Is there something else we need to hit on? I'm trying to look through our little script thing. Did you want to go through the Dawnblade card, Purple?
No. I was just bringing it up as a comparison because I think that I just think it's really interesting and delightful how much Bungie has reacted to the community.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not always something that you get to witness.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you are reading a book series, they're just sits in their house or in their office or whatever writing, and like, do they read what people think and what the theories are about what's going to happen in the next book? I don't know. They don't ever talk about it if they do, you know? Whereas Bungie like interacts with us as a community, and the writers interact with us and they answer our questions sometimes, and sometimes they don't. But then we get really great little Easter eggs like Kinderguardians is now canon. That's because of us, right?
Yeah.
Bungie didn't come up with that. Like, that's a thing that we got to contribute to the game that we love, which is just really cool. And like, will we influence the story? Probably not the overarching story. I don't know. But it's just nice to know that they are listening to us, and it makes me feel like they are trying to make the game better for us and what we want. Whether or not they always succeed is a different issue.
True. Cool. Blue, do we want to kind of figure out a wrap up for this, or how do we want to?
I think that's fair. I mean, I definitely, I realize I have a growingly unique perspective on Destiny from like a mechanics standpoint, because, I've said this a couple times. I actually rely on Green and Beard a lot to tell me what's going on in game, because I to be blunt, don't have time to play the game as much. And also I have lost a lot of interest due to mechanics, not because of the story. I'm actually still endlessly fascinated. If you were here for the live stream, you probably missed, or you probably know that, given the geek out that we had slightly before we started recording about the upcoming information. So like my perspective is like reading the content and hearing about the experiences from people. I think it gives me a really kind of interesting third person not out of body, but like outside perspective, but it's an internal perspective because of the familiarity that, with this group, you have to be familiar with the underlying lore and underlying paradigm within the Destiny universe as a whole. And it's just, to me, it's a really interesting, because the biases in game are really pretty clear. I don't know if that makes sense, but like reading content, it's very easy to analyze said content much less emotionally, much more logically. It's just easier because I'm not hyped up on adrenaline, because I just got done with a raid when I got the information. I don't have that emotional connection that I think a lot of people, and I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. It's just a different perspective, right? And that's kind of the point of this entire conversation. And I know Beard and I've had a lot of conversations about kind of not necessarily that particular topic, but about like bias and about perspective and opinions. We all three of us, actually Purple, even all of us really, have bounced the conversation about biases both in game and out of game around quite a bit. And I think that what that is all to say is that, even if you don't find something supremely interesting from a particular angle, doesn't mean that you can't get interested in it from a different angle, right? That's the beauty of being able to shift bias or shift perspectives, which is kind of also important when you're doing research. And I know Purple, you have, I constantly refer to your podcast about bias in research, because I think it does an excellent job in summarizing what anyone who went through extensive research classes would recognize, right? That when I listened to that episode, I immediately understood what was being said, but I also think that it does a really good job in presenting that information to people who might not have the academic context that I did to understand it. So like, I think it makes it accessible to everyone, which I think is amazing. You and Kex, basically.
Well, thank you. That was really my intention.
Right. No, and I mean, it does. It really does. And I constantly am referencing that episode when I talk to people who are curious about like why that's important. That's a constant reference point that I give, as well as, Kex's chart for validity.
Confirmation chart.
The Kex confirmation. I think that those two, if you're still listening and you're interested in kind of diving into more of like the research side of it, which is definitely where I kind of am starting to fall, that's definitely a good starting point if you're not familiar with that kind of concept, because it gives you, if nothing else, it gives you tools to which you can keep a cheat sheet, I guess, if you will, on your table or on your desk or wherever you're doing, to kind of give you an idea of like, okay, so, on referencing the Kex diagram, here, I'll flip it real quick. I literally have it sitting right next to me. Kex kind of uses the concept of bias and the concept of perception, but he approaches it more from his actual job, which is law enforcement. And so they have to take into account validity of not just the information, but also the person giving the information. So the source of the intel, as well as what's actually being given. So it's got a dynamic grid in which you can kind of plot out, how useful is this information and how authentic is this information. And you want to, that helps you, because then if you're ever in a conversation, or if someone's writing a script for, content to be created, or someone wants to do, role playing, or, whatever, it kind of gives you an idea of like where in the scope of possibilities and reality as defined by this particular game world it can be. And that to me it's a skill that definitely anyone can pick up. It might be a weird way of looking at things, but it is teachable. And just like what we started off with, biases are learned, and so that's both a positive and a negative thing, right? It's like you can teach yourself. You can correct, like, negative biases can be corrected. Positive biases can also be corrupted. So, it's a two-way street there. But I think as far as research goes, the biggest thing, again, to kind of circle back and make this a full circle is not the removal of the bias, but rather the recognition and acknowledgement of the bias. Now, you can try to reduce the bias, but you have to also understand that the bias is always going to be there. Cade's lore entry, the man they call Cade, Cade recognizes that he is a storyteller. And from the very beginning, he calls it out. He says, I'm a storyteller, and this is, I defer things. I deflect with humor, blah, blah. And then he catches himself and then kind of realigns himself. And that's exactly what is a good way of looking at that, is constantly keeping an eye on where you're going and kind of keeping an eye on, okay, what's going on here? Why are we doing that? That's a good habit to build, just not even just in game, but in life in general. And I think that's why, for me, these type of conversations, I've been really quiet just because I've just enjoyed listening to it, because this is the type of stuff that is it's not just accessible, outside of game, but it's also important. Right. This touches on a lot of really, really good life skills, ultimately, I think. But and I can go on for hours about the psychological cognitive bias and stuff, and like the different types of like hermeneutic phenomenology and how that can affect different things. There's a very deep well, if you open it, you can get sucked in pretty quickly. And it's not, and I'll be honest, as a person who kind of sometimes will live there, it's not always a bad thing. It makes you aware of things that I think ultimately makes everyone better off. I think that's really my end, is that, bias is not necessarily negative. Just the same way as retcon is not necessarily a negative thing. Like there is a use for these. These are tools, and they should be used. They shouldn't be ignored. They shouldn't be thrown away, but they also shouldn't be abused. And I think that's where the challenge for me, in just like reality, I think is.
It's like I don't know how to follow that. I'm sorry.
Well, I know that probably got like a little, I don't know, meta or whatever. But that's for me when we talk about, like, when I talk to Purple or Baxter or Bife or any of the other creator, Beard, Green, any of these guys, like when I talk to them and we talk about what's going on in game, but more importantly, we talk about like how it all fits. It's a giant puzzle. And for me, as a person who really, really enjoys putting puzzles together, that's where I get my excitement. That's where my excitement comes from. My excitement doesn't come from, oh my God, roll. I don't even know what gun is. I don't know. Like, I don't care. I don't care. I could get
I'm the same. Like,
so
I don't care.
For me, yeah, go for it.
Well, I was just to say, like, it's kind of a running joke now. Every time I come in here, you're like, let's talk about video games. Like, I don't play video games.
Right. Yeah, I know. It's I'm getting to the same point. So you and I will soon be on the same page there.
And so like I don't play them. This is the first person shooter I've ever played in my life. And my husband played it for a while before he convinced me to start playing it. And the way he convinced me was by telling me the story of The Last Word in Thorn.
Mm-hmm.
Because I sat on the couch and I watched him shoot things, and I was like, yep, you're shooting aliens. That's the thing that you're doing.
That sounds like what Julie says to me. Goodness.
Right. But then I was like, oh, that looks like a cool gun. Like, what's that gun? He's like, oh, it's The Last Word. Here, let me tell you about it. And all of a sudden, now here I am. Right. Because that's more interesting to me.
Yeah. I've stayed with this game longer because of the story than I have any other game.
It's almost like stories are important, you guys.
It's almost like D1's like not having a story was a totally lot. What? Goodness. Blue?
Yes.
Should we move on to shoutouts?
I believe that would be an excellent plot to course.
Who do you want to go first, Captain?
Stardate. Purple, why don't you lead us?
Sure. I will give shout outs to Baxter, who is super awesome, and the whole rest of the Ishtar team, who's growing slowly but steadily, because we are growing slowly but steadily as a Destiny community. And I love all of you guys.
Yay. Baxter and Jazzy and all the
and
the lore
Unisys
diving.
and Aaron and
so many people who are transcribing all these things that make it
Red
so
Renegade and all of my transcribers. I can't even list you all because there are so many of you. Bless each and every one of you for recording all of those things.
Yes. It makes it so much easier. So much easier. Blue or Beard or Blue?
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, weather is getting interesting actually at the moment. I just really want to take a quick second and thank everyone who's, listening. I think that is just kind of similar to what Purple was saying about the team growing there. The community with Focus Fire, I think, is really, you guys give us reason to keep exploring the biases and the perceptions that are in Destiny, right? And I think that can't be said enough. So I really appreciate that, and I just wanted to give a big shout out there. I do also want to give a heads up that I'm hoping to have a sort of big announcement this week, next week, I think, depending on how much sleep I can avoid and get stuff done. I'm hoping to have some stuff that I can put out hopefully here shortly. But yeah, that's all I got right now. I know that's kind of a teaser, but that's entirely what I wanted to go with.
That's such a teaser. Beard?
I'll keep on my vague train, why not? Just general thoughts from my week, I suppose you could say, more than shout-outs over anything else. If you have something you need to tell somebody, make sure you do so. They may not be there tomorrow. If you are worried about anything that might be going on in your life, just kind of count your blessings otherwise. I know that is easier said than done in some cases. Aside from that, just, if you need to talk with anybody, Lord knows I'm always here for it. I know this community is here for it. I know this community in general is pretty open for it. So, don't be afraid to reach out if you feel that there's something that needs to be there, but know that we are all busy people and we will get to you as best as we can. Yeah, just, if you gotta tell somebody you love them, just make sure you do. That's all I got.
Yeah. My shout-outs are going to be a little less vague. My shout-outs are to the various community members who have reached out multiple times this last week for me, just helping me out with my personal stuff too. Because we're all human. We all have our own personal stuff. Second shout-out goes to Purple herself to just thank you for coming on and sharing your life skills, because you literally do this for a job, whereas we just do this for a hobby. And I know I always learn something new each time you come on, which is pretty stinking awesome. So thank you for jumping in with us again.
Aw, thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.
It's always fun to come on with you guys.
For sure, even if it is super late for you.
Yeah, it's definitely after 2:00 in the morning. But that's why we have coffee.
Yes.
Me, every week.
We love you, Beard.
I know, Beard.
All right, guys. Well, we'll see you next week, and we'll probably stay for a bit of an after show. With that, we'll begin to wrap the chat up. Thank you again to those over on Twitch for coming to spend your evening with us. If you'd like to join us for the live streaming of the episodes, please be sure to give us a follow over on twitch.tv/focusedfirechat. Links to all our episode archives can also be found at www.focusedfirechat.com. Please be sure to email us at focusedfirechat@gmail.com with any comments or questions for our team concerning the podcast, and let us know how we're doing by giving us some feedback and a rating over on iTunes as well. Also, be sure to check out all the amazing work being featured over on thelorenetwork.com. So until next time, focus your fire, and may your light shine bright.